Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're diving into a profoundly impactful and honestly devastating moment in history, the 1848 June Days Uprising in Paris. Now, this wasn't just some brief clash in the streets. As we're going to see, this was a massive turning point. It's an event that completely transformed modern media, upended thousands of lives, and ultimately birthed a philosophical critique about society that we are still wrestling with today. We're going to trace this whole story through the physical artifacts left behind, from the literal first news photograph ever published to the desperate handwritten letters of political prisoners, all the way to the ideological fallout. It's an incredible story, so let's get right to it.
Okay, let's start with a really surprising piece of trivia, one that actually bridges this distant 19th century uprising with the media we consume every single day. Think about the news you scrolled through this morning. It was probably packed with photos, right? Well, when did that actually start? When did the very first photograph appear alongside a news story? It's kind of hard for us to even imagine a text-only newspaper, but for a really long time, that was just how it was done.
Well, the answer drops us right into the streets of Paris. On July 1st, 1848, the French weekly periodical L'Illustration published an image showing barricaded Parisian streets. Now, because news gathering was way slower back then, and because they published weekly, this image of the June Uprising, which actually happened between June 22nd and the 26th, didn't hit the presses until July 1st. This image, which was likely an inked engraving based directly on an original photograph, brought the stark, gritty reality of the workers' strike right to the public's breakfast tables. It was an absolute game-changer for journalism.
But to really get why that photo was such a big deal, and to understand the barricades it showed, we have to look at the sheer numbers behind the uprising. Earlier that year, King Louis-Philippe had been overthrown, and a new elected government was in charge. But the working classes very quickly felt completely abandoned by the politicians who set it up. The result? 170,000 unemployed workers rose up in a bloody three-day revolt. Just let that number sink in. 170,000 people taking to the streets in sheer desperation. To truly grasp the massive scale of an event like that, it helps to look at the physical reality left in its wake. And we actually have that, in the form of surviving mail to and from the political prisoners of the uprising. You know, it's so easy to see these people as abstract historical figures, but these letters remind us that they were real individuals swept up in the chaos. Reading this correspondence gives us a first-hand look at the detention sites, the grim daily life inside, and the ultimate fate of the people who fought on those barricades.
When you break down the raw numbers of the fallout from those few days, the human toll is staggering. 1,500 workers died in the rebellion itself, but the aftermath, that brought a massive dragnet by the authorities. Over 12,000 Parisians were arrested. The sheer volume of these arrests, literally overnight, overwhelmed the city's infrastructure. There was simply nowhere to put all these people. That led to thousands being subjected to completely indiscriminate, short-term detention in whatever improvised holding areas the city could find.
In that immediate chaos, while the insurrection was technically still happening, temporary sites like local military barracks were just packed with prisoners. Take this surviving letter, for instance, from the Caserne Tournon barracks. The writer is practically begging his cousin to come claim him, asking for a certificate of employment. This was a super common tactic. Prisoners were desperate to secure these certificates to prove, hey, I'm a working citizen, hoping it would be enough to win their release from these crowded, chaotic barracks.
And this was a dragnet in the truest sense of the word. They swept up absolutely everybody. You've got incoming letters sent to a 15-year-old boy sitting in La Petite Roquette prison, and literally at the exact same time, there are frantic appeals flying to the Belgian ambassador on behalf of a Belgian citizen locked up in Fort de l'Est, north of Paris. Adolescents, non-French citizens, it really didn't matter. If you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you were caught up in it.
Reading the anxious words sent by a brother to that 15-year-old boy we just mentioned, it really humanizes that overwhelming statistic of 12,000 detainees. His brother writes, "I have just learned from friends who are working on your behalf that you will soon be at liberty. Therefore be calm, as soon we will have the pleasure of seeing you." It's a really potent reminder that behind every single one of those arrest records was a terrified family trying to navigate a justice system that was basically collapsing under its own weight.
Now, for about half the prisoners, this nightmare ended within a few days or weeks. But for 6,000 others, this was just the beginning. Their grim progression started with their arrest on the barricaded streets, then moved to local military forts and prisons around Paris. And eventually, as the months dragged on, they were exiled to remote harbor ships on the coast.
In hundreds of cases, they were even deported all the way across the Mediterranean for long-term internment in Algeria.
For those who were sent to the coast, their new prisons were called pontons. These were basically massive, decommissioned harbor ships moored at places like Brest Harbor. We have surviving letters from ships like Lurani and Ledidon, and they show us that these inmates were totally cut off from their families in Paris. We're talking anywhere from 193 to 602 prisoners crammed into a single ship. The conditions in these floating prisons were incredibly harsh, claustrophobic, and intensely isolated.
Displaced out to these coastal harbors, Brest, Cherbourg, Lorient, the prisoners used absolutely whatever means they could find to smuggle mail back to Paris. And as historical artifacts, these are pure gold, because they vividly document the psychological and physical suffering of the detainees. I mean, they weren't just dealing with the loss of their freedom. They were dealing with the agonizing terror of not knowing what was going to happen to them next, or if they'd ever see home again.
Listen to this one excerpt from a prisoner on the ship La Sémillante at Lorient. He writes, "I don't believe we will be in the pontons for much longer. Here, the inhabitants look at us as if we were wild animals, not daring to come close to our ship. It's just heartbreaking." But this perfectly anchors us in the tangible, everyday reality of human suffering. And honestly, grasping that suffering, playing out in real time in 1848, is what sets the stage for us to explore the profound ideological fallout this event caused.
And that brings us to this man, Alexander Herzen. He was one of the most brilliant social thinkers and political journalists of his era. And crucially, he was an actual eyewitness to the 1848 revolution in Paris. He was there. He saw the barricades. He saw the arrests. And witnessing this uprising and its brutal aftermath firsthand drove Herzen to a state of total disillusionment. He watched grand, sweeping political ideals result in thousands of real, everyday people being locked away in prison ships. And it led him to firmly reject ideological zealotry and the whole concept of historical determinism.
Herzen looked at the whole situation and saw this dangerous, irreconcilable disconnect. On the one side, you have these utopian promises, systems that demand we suppress individual liberty today for the sake of some abstract, invisible future happiness. But on the other side, you have the harsh reality right in front of your face, thousands of people perishing unheard today. Herzen fiercely argued against any system that demanded human sacrifice, like the kind those prisoners in the pontons were enduring. He fundamentally condemned the idea that present-day suffering is somehow justified by the mere promise of a future utopia.
The core of Herzen's argument is perfectly captured right here. Distant ends are not ends at all, but a monstrous delusion. Ends must be closer at hand, the laborer's daily wage, or pleasure in the work performed. He was basically saying, look, we cannot condone brutal acts or accept the destruction of human lives right now, for an unpromised, invisible tomorrow. The goals of a society have to be tangible and immediate, improving the actual lives of people today rather than sacrificing them for some grand, unproven theory of history.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a pretty heavy thought. When we look back at that very first news photograph of the barricades, and as we think about the faded ink on those desperate prison letters sent from the pontons, we are left to ponder this timeless, devastating question posed by Herzen's philosophy. Can we ever justify suppressing individual liberty in human life today for the sake of an abstract, invisible future? It's a question born in the bloody streets of Paris in 1848, but it is one that absolutely continues to echo through our world today. Thanks so much for joining me as we explored this fascinating piece of history.